An impending civil war. Personally, I do not see a traditional hot war coming, similar to 1861. But I'm also reminded of Aaron Mate, Chris Hedges, Max Blumenthal, and all the other actual investigative journalists reporting from soon to be civil wars, revolutions, or coups that the elites and liberals never saw it coming until the tanks started rolling in. We should ask, when we talk about an impending American Civil War, who would fight? Whom would they fight? How would it go down? How would it resolve? And as we go along this topic, there are other equally dystopian scenarios: a cultural Cold War, a police state, secession, maybe a corporate feudalist state, or just your run of the mill failed state, or, God forbid, a general strike. In the 1860s, the Civil War was mainly, in my opinion, an agrarian slave labor economy versus an industrial free labor economy. Both were true existential threats to the other. And years before, the northern industrialists, like the lobbyists of today, forced tariffs that benefited their companies over European ones, which raised the cost of everything, especially in the South. There were definite culture wars, but this economic one was the key to the hot war. Is there something similar today? Both sides, however framed, exist in one economy, a banking one, not agrarian, not industrialist. The lockdown is the closest issue, but that is feeding the corporate monopolies, not a replacement economic system. I can also view this all from an increasing police state lens. In the cities, it's police violence and oversized budgets. In rural America, it's the ATF and the FBI. Even without fully realized corporate feudalism, just the decency above all else, neoliberals and their sycophants want a swift reaction to ever-increasing protests and violence, from basic reactions to poverty and corporate oppression to BLM, Antifa, and Christian fundamentalists, all of which were around before Trump and will continue after. For now, we are depending on police not enforcing things like deportations and evictions. We've been in the middle of a cultural Cold War. Partisanship, moral superiority, info bubbles, social media degeneration, all of this has been increasing. Sure, there will be more instances of small groups and individuals causing mayhem and violence, but we will continue to look to the state for now. For a hot war, we need to look at and keep an eye on the rise of militias. We need to ask, what would it take for a Chicagoan like me to march on Atlanta? What could they be doing in Georgia that would motivate me to do that? They could introduce slavery again. Of course, they won't. But what equally or similar terrible things might they do to their own people that would cause me to take up arms? Maybe if the elections were legitimately thought of as illegitimate, as they were in 1860, but today Trump loyalists, about 20 million people, a fraction of the vote, not all Republicans, I'm talking about Trump loyalists, are a fraction of the vote, and they are the only ones truly thinking it was illegitimate. But also, in my opinion, more than half the country thinks all elections are generally illegitimate. There's a good chance that the Republican Party, and this is crazy, will become the party of the people, if in rhetoric only. And if they figure out how to actually solve a problem, they'll be unstoppable. But as the neoliberals continue to say, not now, and don't worry, and it's your label and tone, not the economy, stupid, and the left populists are silenced by capital, the right-wing populists take the whole lane. There was some grifter on YouTube, and I know he was one because at the end he was hawking vitamins. So he says that the goal of the lockdown is to crush non-corporate businesses so that we all become dependent on handouts. So we will then allow the state to do anything, and that's socialism. course, he's a grifter and he doesn't have the definitions right, and it's a fear-based reaction. But if I didn't know any better, he would sound righteous. Uh, there's hints of truth in all of that. Another person, I don't know if they were a grifter or not because they weren't selling me vitamins, but they were commenting on how the book White Fragility is the same, though reversed, as Hitler's race theory, which, again, at a surface level view, and if I didn't know any better, might have a little resonance. So while we mock the fear and ignorance, and especially of the charlatans and the grifters who prey on that, our moral superiority does not erase the reality. We can't pretend it's not existing or wish it away. I see mostly that there are, in fact, people on the right who want a war. And there are people on the left who are deathly afraid of people on the right. So we should be asking, how can states be punitive towards each other? What actual thing can they do other than this cultural war? What would make us march on Atlanta? What would make them march on Portland or something? And while all that's happening, how can the elites use the idea of war to mess with us? And remember, with all this cultural and legislative gridlock, we are left with corporate imposed law. And let's ask finally again at the very beginning, who is fighting this and whom would they fight? And if not a hot civil war, then how does this play out in a corporate state? I think that if we talk about these things and exhaust some of these other explanations, we are left with what we want personally, and that our wants together are very similar. And then we can have solidarity on a class basis. We can have solidarity on a individual property versus corporate monopoly basis. We can have solidarity based on, we want to fight for us, not the rich.
The idea that we may be getting into a position to have another civil war seemed really extreme to me. It seemed like, other conspiracy theories I've heard over the years, but I'm concerned now that you do get to a point where compromise doesn't work anymore, and where people quit talking to each other, and where the sources of information are so separate. And I guess that's the one thing I like to focus on, is that we've gotten to the point with the proliferation of media, both television, internet, and other sources, that everyone has their own silo, and they're hearing information that they want to hear, and they're getting it reinforced over and over again in a feedback loop.
Yep.
And that you're not getting a picture from the opposition. You're not paying any attention to them. You're dismissing them. And I try to avoid doing that by listening as much as I can to to Fox and to One American News and to the some of the other more bizarre ones, and looking at things on the internet. But I find it's really difficult to do. I don't know if you experience that or not, but it's physically painful to listen to them. I just want to I want to strike back at them, and of course I can't. I don't engage in a lot of feedback in the way of tweets or other things like that. But that was one of the conditions that set things up in the Civil War. As things were expanding, people only got the news that people, at that time it was divided by region. So if you were in southern Alabama, you didn't get any news except what filtered through the people in charge of the state of Alabama. So you never heard, a Massachusetts point of view or a Michigan point of view back then. You were
Yeah.
only getting what you had, and it was divided by region. Well, now we've done the same thing, but we've done it according to these artificial channels that are set up. And I'd like to figure out a way to break through that. So that was kind of my notion for today. I don't know if that's of interest to you specifically, but I did hear you mention that.
Try to offset a civil war. Yeah, that's an interesting.
Well, I mean, this could be prescient, and we'll go back 2 years from now and say, remember on December 13th when we talked about this?
Yeah.
But uh, I, my hope would be, of course, that if you could make people aware of how close we came this last week. I mean, for me, what would happen if the Supreme Court had taken this case up and had found in Trump's favor and thrown out the election results and let him serve another term? Where would I be? Would I be ready to start a civil war on that account? So I know how I would feel. And so I guess that's the same way that these people are, the opposition is feeling now. You have to put yourself in the other person's shoes. You have to imagine the tables turned. And now if we'd gone the other way, what would I be doing?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's hard to figure out. Well, of course, I think most of us on this side of this particular little fence tend to want to talk about, straddling that fence and, getting people on both sides, which doesn't seem to gather. It doesn't seem to work very well. I mean, personally, I'm of the opinion that there are a great many forces of various kinds, be they military, rather governmental or political kinds of, or economic things that are putting out all this information and massive misinformation. I mean, the Koch brothers crews have just been doing this now for 40 years, very consistently, all the time. I mean, I've got tired of talking about it because I'm constantly saying this. And of course, I mean, both Sarah Chase and Mary, what's her name? Well, the woman writes for the Courier, for the New Yorker on dark money, and yeah, and going and Rachel Maddow talking about here's how this funds are happening. And so it's all out there, but of course the folks on the right are not going to listen or read anything from Rachel Maddow or Sarah Chase. They just won't read it. So it's kind of bizarre and difficult to say, well, what's an answer, not just the answer. And I wish I did. Though.
Right. I think one of the problems is the public forum. To have a true public forum, you have to have a place where people of varying opinions gather to share or debate those opinions, and we don't have a common forum. I don't go to Trump rallies, and his followers don't go to Black Lives Matter rallies or to any other feminist groups or other groups or Democratic rallies for that matter. So we don't hear the unfiltered opinion of the other side. And then oftentimes, if you do find yourself in company of someone who's of a different political ilk, you end up repeating the sound points that you've heard on TV. You're just going to regurgitate the kinds of things that you've been exposed to. So it really doesn't go very far. So I thought, getting back to these points that I was talking about before, maybe this would be a place, instead of talking about the conclusions that we have made, if we discussed with people who don't agree with us, if we discussed what the real underlying issues are. So rapidly changing economy, the national growth at that time was from immigration. Now it is a combination of immigration and the changing demographic of, more people of color. The disagreement on the purpose of the federal government. Some people want to eliminate the federal government altogether. I think, Paul, you mentioned the Koch brothers several times. I think all they want is an army to protect their
Yeah.
stuff. And then they collapse the civil discourse is pretty self-evident. And the last one, different dreams about, what kind of nation do you want to have? If you don't agree on what the goal behind your governmental efforts are, or your civic efforts are, if you don't agree on where you want to go, it's kind of hard to come to any kind of consensus. So that was a starting point for me. And Paul and I were just discussing the idea that if we could get people to focus on those issues rather than just fire bullet points at each other about what they've heard on radio or TV, to really articulate what are your feelings about the federal government, and relate it personally rather than repeating what you're hearing from the media. That might be a way to break down the binary nature of the discussion. So that's where we were. Paul, I'd like for you to continue with that idea that you were saying that you can't you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You can bring somebody in, but if they're unwilling to listen, then you're stopped in the beginning.
Yeah, well, I would not necessarily just concede that slavery didn't matter, because the reason that the government is built the way it is because of slavery. They were trying, they wanted to make sure they could keep their slaves, and the economic aspect of it was built on slavery. I mean, the people in Mississippi white people, there were more millionaires in Mississippi white people than there were in New York at the time of war starting. So I mean, they had a lot of money, and so the whole idea of getting rid of slavery was basically, we will take all of your money away, which
Right.
it sounds like now. We're going to take all your money away.
We're going to close all your businesses. Yeah.
All your businesses are going to be gone,
Yeah.
And so, and the ramifications of that are very complicated. Obviously, over the years, we've done all the things that we did to try to keep that caste, as you like to talk about it, Michael, is, keep that going. But that, the money part of it was so important. I mean, that's what driving all this kind of stuff is what's driving it now.
Money drives people. Like, we can have ideals and I can have them if I'm not under threat. But when I've lost my job and my health care, I'm not thinking about my democratic ideals. I've lived that experience.
No, that's right. That's exactly the point. So, and then we have, obviously, in this particular situation, and it happened in the Civil War too, because I mean, the French were busy helping trying to get a good line on the cotton out of the South at the time, so they were like stirring up trouble too, because they figured, hey, we can get cotton was an important thing. I mean, it was really important money supply. And we got the same goddamn thing going on now, where the Russians were busy doing that. Hey, look, or the Saudis, bless them, right. Such friends we have, Saudis, and so you got to understand every last bit of that in order to really get into it. And most people don't want to do the work required to think about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work. Now, I know you brought up something. This was something that in my research I'm finding a lot of that I didn't think of before, of really looking at that economic question prior to slavery. And I'm starting to get of the comparing an agrarian slave labor economy versus a northern industrial free labor economy are two types of economies that cannot coexist.
Mm-hmm.
Free labor to drive prices down and get your shop going and all these things versus slave labor, like, these can't coexist. So they're automatically existential threats to each other. And even before the slavery, you're going to take my property away and change my economic model. Even before that, the northern industrialists, if we think of them like the corporate lobbyists of today, we're lobbying for all these sorts of tariffs and things as you bring in the cotton and everything of like, so their goods in the north were bought from the north, not from Europe. And the south is like, well, I'm glad you're trying to be a real capitalist to make money, but you just doubled the prices of everything in my state.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the economics of the time were terrible. If you weren't absolutely filthy rich, yeah, yeah, I don't. My study of the economics prior to the Civil War is not that fabulous. I've read enough to know what was going on, but it's certainly that's how they built the government to maintain that, and said so explicitly. We're going to keep this here. We're going to keep this many black people, and we're going to divide the states up so the small states will be able to stop the big people from running over them, which is what we're looking at again. It's funny how that works. That never goes away. But nowadays that the size is not so much a function of the number of people as it is both the population and the economics of the thing. Because I mean, the folks in some of the northern states now are doing just perfectly well with some of the stuff they've swiped from California in the way of technology. Hey, and yeah, so it's. I keep coming around the same thing as you do. I keep coming back around to this. How do you talk to people about something that they need to learn?
Right. Well, I think one of the big differences between now and then is it's one economy now. It's not two economic systems. We're all
Oh yeah,
under a corporate system and a banking financial system. We're not an agrarian economy. We're
no.
not a manufacturing economy. We're a service and banking economy.
And you can't really make a living without buying into that system.
Without buying into that, and it's pervasive. It's everywhere. It's the north, the south, the urban, the rural, the black, the white. We're all under a corporate economy, and that's where, again, of course, the progressives will say is like that's the horseshoe theory of like, yeah, there are people on the left who also don't want government or corporate tyranny, and it's affecting our livelihoods and where we shop and what choices we have. I mean, it's affecting the seed that's put into the ground to grow the food we eat. Like,
Right.
it's affecting everything. So that's our commonality. To get there, though, to get there, I would think, I don't know.
Well, yeah, well, at that point, you don't have to understand it's not a global economy. I mean, an economy for the United States. It's for the whole damn planet. So and the people that are actually in charge are the corporate people. I mean, Trump. I mean, the whole boys with on the right. The freedom. What do they call that? Anyway, well, yeah.
Proud Boys.
Huh?
Proud
Proud
Boys.
Boys, yeah. Well, that's just an army they've assembled. You need to have that, and that's kind of scary too, because what happens when they start shooting?
Right. Now, I throw this into we keep trying to go back to like the Civil War. That's what we've kind of been taught, and that's a hot war. And without that economic existential threat, that kind of battle between two economics, that we're not having that. But there is the cultural component, which was definitely there in the 1860s and 50s, and it's definitely here today. There are some, maybe if we start talking about, instead of a civil war, a new civil war, what about ideas like a cultural Cold War? How does that play out? Is that a better term for what's going on?
Might be.
Well, I've been saying this now for quite some time that the problem in our politics is that everything becomes binary. No matter what the issue is, the Republicans stake one position and the Democrats naturally stake the opposing position. So it doesn't matter what it is. That's why we have the problem with masks and, social distancing, because Republicans were saying, we don't like this, particularly Trump. So Democrats were saying it and Trump responds to it. you cannot agree. Agreeing with the opposition is a form of weakness. As I mentioned in discussion last week about compromise, you have to want to compromise in order to facilitate it. You can't go into a discussion saying I'm not going to give an inch and progress.
This is identity politics. That's what they mean.
Yeah, right. So I think the thing that I'm looking for is how can we stake out a perspective that is not one of those binary choices? How can you start assembling a group of people who are willing to look at both sides and base their decisions on some kind of fact or data, and not simply push back against someone else? Paul, what you were saying before is somebody has to learn it, so what's your position on polar satellites? Well, I don't have one because I don't know anything about them. So if everything became an issue of what's your position now, first of all, tell us what you know. Tell us something you know. That's why I say on issues like immigration, I found it funny that the people who were screaming the loudest about immigrants were the people in Nebraska and Iowa, who were not really affected all that much. The people along the border didn't have a problem so much.
Yeah.
But the people far away from it, they were that way because basically they have something that they're pissed off about, and they want to express it in any way that they can. So bring me an issue. If you feel that way, I feel the other way. No matter what it is, you bring up a new topic, and they will take the opposite view just reflexively. It's a natural reflex to go in the opposite direction. It reminds me of the old cartoon of duck season, rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season. It's, whatever you say, if you say rabbit season, I'm going to say duck season. It doesn't matter what the issue is. I'm going to take the opposite position. So rather than engaging in that, try to focus down on a lower level and talk about, what are your concerns about an issue like immigration, and how can you express them personally? Beginning with, how many immigrants do you know? Well, I know a few. Most of them are probably better U.S. citizens than the ones who grew up here. But begin with things that you know and focus on things that you know. So
now, this was the same thing I've seen in the political fight. The only conversations I ever won or did well in was when I skipped past it all. I did not engage that. I simply said, this is what I want, and I was genuinely passionate about it. And people responded to that. They didn't take it as an identity attack trigger or whatever. It was, oh, I want those too.
Yeah. And
you have to learn how to discuss that and discipline yourself. You can't just fall into bad habits once you have a good opening line. It's not a sale, it's a genuine thing. But I'd like to add, how do we not only say what you personally want and what you personally can do, but how do you, in the next breath or the same breath, introduce solidarity? How do we do this? Because again, I like the idea of bringing it back to your own personal needs, but I don't want to make it about individual. That I've seen that you weaponize that. Oh, well, recycling is the thing. So you're the problem. If you don't recycle, the earth will die. Like, no, if we stop making all these bullets and cars, maybe the earth will live. Like, how do we introduce solidarity while also emphasizing your own personal needs?
Well, it's funny that you should talk about that, because I was just thinking that certainly not happened in the last year because of this coronavirus. I haven't done any studying of my Spanish studies, but I set about to learn Spanish as well as I could, because I wanted to go to Spain and go to Spain, watch some flamenco dancers, and maybe a little bit, run around Sevilla, look at the place and have a nice visit to Spain, which I managed to do. But in the process of learning, improving my Spanish from where it was beforehand, it was, my grades in high school and some in college Spanish, and I could sort of get around it in a little bit. But once I decided that I needed to go to Spain, I wanted to go to Spain, so I needed to learn Spanish enough to do it. I, I went over here to 100% Spanish, where I knew the woman that runs it, and said, hey, I need to have a session on a regular basis for this. And so she hooked me up with this Venezuelan gal, who's a sweetheart all the way around. We had a good time. We just talked and talked. And she was like, well, you know how to speak Spanish, so why? Basically, that's what she's saying. Why are you doing this except to get better at it because you know how? And I said, well, I need to learn it. I'm trying to use all the tools that I have at hand to learn it because I have this long goal in mind, period. And in the process, oh yeah, by the way, I want to pay my Spanish teacher is Guatemala. Her sister got trapped in Caracas, and she can't get out of Caracas. And I'm hearing she's saying this, and they're trying to raise some money for her so she can get out of there because, she was on the wrong side. And, this is just a woman and her kids, not somebody who's, trying to smuggle drugs or anything. I just talked about her like that, and they got some money together and got her out. And so, she's here. And so now for me, it's like, I just basically set about to see how many people how many folks could I get from who aren't from here to enter into my life in some way. I talk to them just as a part of, hey, Luis de Leon, who is a drummer for Appalachian, nice guy. Had some nice chats with him. It turns out he was out of Guatemala, and he had fled Guatemala because he was a journalist working there, and so he said one day he got a call from a friend of his who said, you better leave town. And Louis was like, yeah. So he said the next day the guy called up and said, you better get out of town now, period. And he did. And he got here. And this is not even the hot spot. Guatemala. It wasn't at that time, except for those who were interested. So for me, this is how we cannot not plug in to the varieties of the culture that are around us.
Internet culture.
There. And you might as well take advantage of it. I mean, and in Louisville, it's really
people that deny culture are the academics, and that's why they sound out of touch.
Yeah, well, well, that I know that there's a whole bunch of everybody likes. I don't know anybody who would refuse to go to the Mayan Cafe to have chalupas, because they know that guy can really cook.
Oh yeah.
That place is really good. And, and true for all the various, hey, this place, the best place to eat Vietnamese food is out there in Iroquois Park. There's a guy.
Maybe it's a
Vietnamese kitchen.
A greater appreciation of the social experiment we're in currently, especially with COVID, of like, okay, there's all this noise. Okay, yeah, fine. But remember how to connect to people?
Yeah.
A world of people who are just dying to have a conversation about something other than the end of the world.
Yes. Yeah, indeed.
Let's celebrate.
Well, that's what these are for, I guess, at this point. It's the best we got. We can at least talk a little bit to somebody different. And
it's an interesting take on that, Paul. The idea of a multicultural environment has always appealed to me. I mean, I like seeing people from different cultures, even if that means people from a different section of the U.S. But someone from another country is always delightful to hear what they have to say, or to dine at an ethnic restaurant of some sort. But we seem to be moving away from that. That what we hear about, especially from the right, is make America great again, means what, at least what I think that means, is make it white again, and let's go back to one notion of what the proper culture is. But also on the left, I've mentioned this before, that I don't like the idea of Black Lives Matter, because now that puts a whole group of people together into one unified group that are really not unified. There are lots of people of color of different backgrounds and come from different countries, some born here, some the children of slaves, some the children of millionaires. You know, there's a difference among these people, but we, instead of highlighting the differences, we want to amalgamate them into a single group. And I think that's part of the problem. Once you become part of that group, this discussion now about cabinet offices, well, we have to have a representative of our community. Well, they mean someone who's Black. Well, that means I guess they're not part of my community.
And they're all the same too.
They're all the same, and you know, if I can't support a a candidate for an office because they're not the same color as me. I mean, where how do we get to the point where it has to be, you know, in every issue you have to choose Coke or Pepsi? You know, you have.
Well, it's the same. It's always the narrative, and we know now the narrative is more important than guns or money.
Right.
And like one of the examples of who are the two most ardent proponents of tradition, not traditional, but of the institution of marriage. Really religious people and gay couples.
Yeah. All right.
And starting to say, no, you can, it's about the thing you want, not about the label you give yourself, because the thing you want is actually under threat. The label has been under threat for a long time in the culture war.
Right.
But the actual war, you can't get married and have kids and buy a house anymore. You can't do that. And the person that lets you do that will have your undying love.
Yeah, right.
So it's about, okay, it's introducing that narrative. It's okay to have all these different coalitions and go after what you want. So I'd like to introduce, and this might be really dangerous, okay, people on the right, here are other groups, not only just the gay marriage thing, but like, let's say religious people in other countries, not just your neighborhood. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a danger to empower them, but it's also the American experiment. So maybe I should be for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Paul, to your point about people needing to learn, I think we've evolved a culture in America that is essentially, you know, it's either good or it's bad. There's very little nuance. There's not, Americans don't like gray areas. They want yes or no. You know, they don't, they're not comfortable. They're not comfortable with, you know, having a lot of different things in the air all at once. I think that might be one of the underlying causes for all the separations. That I can't figure out all these issues on my own. So I pick a side, and whatever my side says, that's what I'm for.
Well, yeah, and I'm at this point, you know, I get kind of bogged down because I'm spending most of my life learning stuff. Mm-hmm. That's just what I do, you know, and not necessarily to the point of being super good at it. It's just I learn things. I find something I'm interested in. I go read about it. What does it tell me about this? Oh, that's nice, you know, blah, 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 blah. And I've done that my whole life. And as far as I'm concerned, this is a very fine way to live, because that means I'm constantly learning more stuff, and I can get along a little better with people. I can learn to do things I couldn't do before, and so on. All of the advantages of having any kind of an education. And I mean, I don't go sign up, go to college. I don't have time, don't want to do it. It's too late in my life to try to do, you know, get into college. But I can learn stuff, and will continue to do so until I die, I guess. And you know, in the process of some of the things that I do, I can occasionally put a little something in somebody's head that says, well, what about this? Because I happen to be singing about it, or, you know, whatever it might be. Right. And, you know, so I, you know, in that regard, I think, well, I don't have any grand fixes, but I can do some little stuff on a regular basis. And that's kind of where I'm at about this at this point.
Yeah.
I keep doing it whenever I can help out, talk to different people. I get to, I have I have some very long conversations with Adrian, who's seriously opinionated in spite of herself, although she's not. I mean, she's very leftist, but she takes care of people, and they live in this little trailer park up in the Grange, and she takes care of people that are around her. She organizes stuff for them, that kind of thing. And her husband, Alan, who is basically a German, and a honky white guy you ever saw. He's a German guy, and although he's more than that, that's the fun part about it. He's got his mother's, another matter. He's got a variety of connections into his past. And so, I think I always wondered how he and Adrian actually connected up so nicely as they did. He falls in love with her. I think that was basically it. But they're doing this. He's a guy who goes for the shooting practice. He's a boss man out there on the range, right? Whatever, I forget what they call themselves. But he goes out there and he's the guy that says to everybody, okay, you can't do that, do it this way, and so on, because he's military, got that big military background. And so I got that bunch of stuff, and I like to watch that. And so I know I can put a little tiny bit of stuff into it with Adrian, because she'll pay attention to me, and so I'd like to put a little something in there about what's going on, and here's this thing going on, what's going on. And Alan is real seriously interested in Democratic politics in Oldham County, so he knows those people. so I'm getting more and more of that kind of thing coming at me, and I'm like, oh, okay. And
that's interesting, because we're learning. I think we're really learning how to use the internet. I think that's what this is happening.
Yeah.
It's a big growing pain, because before we were talking about, it just before the internet, there was that, don't talk about politics and religion in mixed company. And like, that was the main rule. Like, you knew the room you were going into because you knew the people who were already there. They were your friends or family or some work group, or you knew what the situation was, the expectations were. And now we have to learn how to do that in a more anonymous or public or open way. And our first inclination when we first interneted was, you just said something that no one would ever walk into a real room and say off the bat.
Right.
And now we're like, okay, like, I have to not do that. Like, we are basically 4 years old now in the internet lifespan, and
Right.
we're acting like 4-year-olds, and eventually we'll act like teenagers. Oh my God. And then eventually maybe we'll adult, even though not all adults adult.
yeah,
Hopefully the kids who are being educated in the internet and about the internet will have that as a natural way of doing things. I should tell you, I talk a lot about education. My grandson Simon struggled. He's in 4th grade now, and he's struggled in school for 3 years. He's always had a hard time because he gets distracted easily and talks and doesn't listen to the teacher. He just got straight A's this year on non-traditional instruction, all 100% across the board. He's doing fantastic. And so I look at that and I say, well, finally there's something that fits him. The old style didn't fit him. So I'm hoping he won't go back to that.
Well, I can bring this back to the terrible topic of we were talking about an impending civil war, I think.
Right.
And one quick note is, like, personally, I don't think of a traditional hot war. I'm thinking more of the cultural Cold War, but I'm also reminded of other investigative journalists like Aaron Monte and Chris Hedges and Max Blumenthal are always saying, well, when I was in the place before the revolution or civil war or coup, none of the elites and barely any of the, let's call them liberals or the whatevers, thought it was going to happen until the tanks rolled by their window.
Right.
Like, this is the case of every time. So I don't think one's going to happen, but then again, no one ever does.
Right.
So I kind of want to introduce here of I talked about the cultural Cold War. There's some other things that can happen, and they can happen together. There's the cultural Cold War, the hot Civil War, police state, secession, a new corporate feudalism that I think we're going into, or a failed state, or I wish a general strike, but that's not going to happen. What do you think about those terms, especially like secession and police state coming forward as we're talking about this impending Civil War?
It's
Well-
always difficult, I assume, what you were saying about not realizing it until the tanks started rolling. I think any change is difficult to see when you're in the early stages of it. I know, Paul, I think we talked quite a bit about this back in the 90s when computers were just becoming something that showed up in everyone's home, how, you and I could look at the situation and say, hey, you're going to own not only are you going to own a computer, you're probably going to own 5 of them. And and you'd get this denial from everyone. Oh, I don't know. I'm never going to do that. And so it's difficult when you are in a situation where you see the impending change, whether it's a hot war, civil war, culture clash, whatever it might be, but you see the inevitability of the change, and you're faced with people who are in denial.
Yeah.
Because when someone is in denial, you can't communicate with them. Oh my God, whatever, my
well, the only communication left is violence.
Well, not, I wouldn't say necessarily, but they're not ready to discuss the reality of something that they can't accept. I mean, that's where, Trump is the hyperbole of that right now. He can't discuss the upcoming Biden administration because he cannot accept it. Even if it's going to have to be shoved down his throat, he cannot accept it. He will not get to the point where he can discuss the reality of the situation because he denies the reality.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's worrisome, to say the least, because he is exceptionally good at denying reality.
Yeah.
And convincing other people that he's right. I mean, frankly, I can't believe people are screaming and carrying on when he says something like that. I can't. You actually believe that he's going to be able to do this? Have you not paid any attention whatsoever? And, well, I guess they did. And
well, we got to watch wrestling because it wasn't about whether you knew what the script was or if The Rock was going to be on the show or who has the better organization. It's about the yelling.
Yes, I understand that. about that.
There was some grifter on YouTube I was watching, and I knew he was a grifter because at the end he was hawking vitamins. But he said the goal right now, the lockdown, is to crush non-corporate businesses, which I agree with, so that we are all dependent on handouts from the government. I'm like, okay, so we allow the corporate state to do whatever they want because we're dependent on the handouts. I'm like, okay, and that's socialism. I'm like, oh, you're a grifter. Where are my vitamins? Okay. Now, if I didn't know any better, and if I didn't know what the socialist said the definition of socialism was,
right.
He would sound right. He would sound righteous, and he's speaking in an affirmative way. I could see how I could be receptive to that if I didn't know him better.
Yeah.
Another one was he wasn't selling vitamins, so maybe he was a true believer, but he was coming on to say how the novel White Fragility is the same, though reversed, of Hitler's race theory. And I'm like, okay, if I don't think about that, I could be swept away by that. And I was like, I see the appeal. And so while I may mock the fear and ignorance and the charlatans and grifters who prey on that fear and ignorance, I can't let my moral superiority erase that's happening. So it's being queued up and it's being used, no matter the right reasons or not wrong, it's being used.
Yeah.
And do you want to buy some vitamins? Because
grifters, are there forever and ever and ever. I've decided that I'm not going to write I'm not going to write, 6 for 5 after all those years. Now, I mean, what I could write compares not at all to what Trump was doing. And so, yeah, I'll have to, I've been thinking I'll write something other than that. And Dustin, you probably don't know this. This is something I've talked about for years and years, of writing this novel based on this cookware salesman that I had hung up with for a while. The guy who was hustling glassware, right? Al Ross. And, I did a little spell with him just because, I didn't have a job. And he said, yeah, I used to pay me like $200 a week at that time. And that was a fairly good chunk of money at the moment. And I learned a whole lot about how to hustle people from Al. He was very good at it. He was real good at it. And he was a friendly guy, very friendly guy, he'd walk into a room full of people and, how you doing, blah, blah. And he would make up a story on the spot, whatever the story was about how come he's in there and why he's selling, he's got to get rid of these glass because I was the idiot and I broke up the glass. And so, he has to get rid of it. And so they'll sell it to him for some of you guys for, like price, wholesale price. And he would sell all the stuff and leave.
Urgency and preference. It's a good sales tactic.
But, and it was very good. And there were usually one or two guys who could kind of understand there was a hustle going on, and he'd come out there and Al would like set him up so he could go and hustle somebody else right down the line. And one thing I've learned from Al, and I keep in mind all the time, is that you can't fuck an enemy. You can only fuck a friend.
Yeah.
And that was the lesson, okay, you can't. It's just not possible to screw somebody who's already mad at you.
Right.
You can fuck somebody who's not. Okay. So, and this is the thing about Trump. I mean, I've been reading about Trump since the 90s. So it was real clear what kind of guy he was.
Yeah, it's been crystal clear. I know he's been used. I see this too, and maybe this is another reflection of social media, just how Barack Obama was used for wish fulfillment. Like during the election, I'm like, are you listening to the same speeches? No, you're not. You're just pretending like he's going to fulfill all your wishes. Okay. Same thing with Trump. It's like, do you remember him from like that television show and from the wrestling and from the New York headline? No. Okay. So he's just as good or as bad as you want him to be. It doesn't matter. It's all about your wants.
Right.
So this is that in America, it's we all as humans react a certain way, but in America, we're particularly consumerists. Have it our way for $1, and that's all we need to do, and everything's going to be fine.
So, yeah, well, the problem with having a conversation like this is that often by the time I'm done, I'm depressed.
That was certainly not the intent, but I mean, how do you talk about Civil War without a little bit of depression? But no, I think that there's room for more discussion like this. I think just talking about these things makes you realize that you can pull back and take a more historical perspective on what's going on. You don't have to get caught up in it. Dustin, what you were saying before about not engaging in tit for tat, but stating what it is that you want. I take a lot from that. I think that's an excellent way of looking at it, because
and that's how I don't get depressed. That's how I get motivated, because when we start dissecting this and we realize, okay, this is all the grand power game, right? So there's that. So like, screw that. I don't have power like that. Like that's not a conversation I even want to be in. Why did I get suckered into being in one for 10 years? Let's go meet people from Guatemala. Let's talk about things I want. Let's give me something useful. You've been feeding me sugar this whole time, and now I have diabetes. Can I have something else, please?
Yes. Right.